Stephanie, and I'm here to talk about the books that I read in February. And I'm really excited to get into it because there's books that I have really strong opinions on, and I feel like that wasn't the case in 2017. There was just a year of a lot of mediocre books. And I almost got to the point where I was dreading doing wrap-ups because I just felt like there was so many books that I didn't care about one way or another that I almost didn't even want to force myself to talk about them because I didn't care. So I'm really excited to get into some books that I have both loved and despised. So as usual, I am going to start this going from the books I loved the most to the books I loved the least. So the first book I'm going to talk about was a total surprise for me because if you would have asked me last year what kind of reader I am and what kind of genres I tend to go for, I'm going to tell you sci-fi would not have been one of them. I describe myself as someone who reads literary fiction, horror, and mysteries. I don't like sci-fi, I don't like fantasy. This year I've been trying to open myself up to more genres and try to see if there is something in those genres that I would like. And I've surprised myself. My favorite book of the month, like I said, was a shock to me, but that was Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel. This story starts off with a girl named Rose who's about 11 years old. She's riding her bike in Deadwood, South Dakota. She falls into a ditch, and in that ditch is a giant metal hand that she falls into. And when the authorities find her, they quickly shush her away and just tell her to kind of forget everything that she's seen. Years later, she is the leading physicist working on the project dealing with this metal hand and is tasked with finding the rest of the parts that go to this statue. This story is told in kind of an epistolary format. You're reading, when you're reading it, it's kind of like interview transcripts, like it'll say like location, you know, underground bunker, time here, and it's the person interviewing and then members of her team, and they'll relay experiences and whatever happened that day and briefings. And so I guess it is kind of epistolary. I would 100% recommend the audiobook. It just had this full cast of characters, and the way they delivered dialogue was just so believable and emotional, and I think especially with some of the more smart alecky characters, it's a lot easier for me to take those characters when I can hear them actually giving life to that dialogue. I found myself so emotionally invested in the story that I was reacting to it out loud. I was like, no! So the next book in the series, Waking Gods, just came in on Overdrive, so I am so excited to get to that. I can't even begin to tell you. So all this to say, maybe I do like sci-fi. So if you have sci-fi recommendations for me that aren't like crazy, that you think I would like if I liked this, I would really like to know. So you can always comment down below because I'm open to it. My next favorite book of the month was not quite as much of a surprise as Sleeping Giants because it's just, I read it and I was like, this is a Stephanie book if there ever was one. And that was The Dry by Jane Harper. This is the first in what's going to be her Aaron Falk series. So Aaron Falk, he is a policeman, but he works in the financial crimes investigations unit. He has to go home for a funeral because of the tragic death of his childhood friend and his childhood friend's family. So going into the story, going into the funeral, we know that Aaron was run out of town years ago when he was a teenager over the suspicious death of a teenage girl that happened years ago, and he has not gone back to the town since. And so he is going to this funeral. He's just going to be in and out and get out of there. But he gets a message from his childhood friend's father that says, we need to talk after the funeral. I know where you really were the night that that girl was murdered, and I know that you lied about your alibi. He meets with his friend's father, of course, and they get into it, and he ends up investigating his childhood friend's murder and the situations around that. So, oh my gosh, it was just so compelling. It gave me everything I wanted in a mystery novel. It had a lot of ton of French similarities. You know, we have a very interesting narrator where we don't know what kind of information they're hiding from us. We don't know how reliable they are as a narrator of their own story and what kind of baggage they're bringing into this. And it was fantastic. I loved the way it was laid out, and I thought it was just amazing and a perfect mystery. So if you love Ton of French, I would definitely check out The Dry by Jane Harper. Also, I didn't mention that this takes place in Australia, which is kind of a big thing. So even though I didn't mention it, this novel does have a strong sense of place, and I listened to this as an audiobook, and the narrator was fantastic because dialogue like this obviously was meant to be written with a bit of an Australian accent, and so hearing it just really made the story come to life. So another audiobook that I totally recommend. And the next book I loved was a horror novel No one is shocked. This was The Last Days of Jack Sparks by Jason Arnopp. So the character Jack Sparks is kind of a controversial internet celebrity. He does some investigative journalism. He's very controversial and he kind of gets off on instigating things. He's kind of a troll, but he's most well known for his investigative journalism. He wrote a book just really digging into the underbelly of the drug world and ended up having to check himself into rehab afterwards. So he just really gets into whatever he is investigating, and he decides that he wants to investigate the paranormal for his next big work. He heads from the UK to Italy to watch an exorcism. He tweets something very disrespectful about how fake it all is, and he also laughs while the exorcism is being performed, which unfortunately puts a bit of a supernatural target on his back. And the way that we're reading this story, we know we're reading a posthumous manuscript. So you know at the end of the story that Jack Sparks dies, which does add a whole level of tension because whatever he did, there is deadly consequences. And so you're kind of watching how all of that escalates. And we get letters from the editor kind of every now and then, and notes and footnotes that say like, actually that's not true. And so stuff starts happening to Jack, who, as I mentioned, is a self-centered, arrogant jerk. So he tweets that, and so someone hacks into his YouTube, uploads a very creepy 45-second video, and then the video disappears and he doesn't know who did it or why. So he starts becoming paranoid and looking for help, and it's kind of this whole downward spiral. This was such a readable book and a very fun time with some legitimately creepy scenes thrown in there. Was Jack Sparks a complete tool? Yes. But it was definitely really fun to read a story. As horrible as that is. So also last year, if you would have asked me if I would ever pick up anything that advertised itself as fantasy, I would have probably also said, no, I don't like fantasy. But I owned this book and I wanted to give it a shot. So this is The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. And this was a book on my 15 books to read before 2018, of which I have now read 3. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed this. I am really glad I did the audiobook specifically for this because there was some stuff that was very much out of my comfort zone, and it was really good to have a audiobook to kind of propel me forward and for me not to get too stuck on certain things that I'm not used to reading about. So the audiobook helped keep me going when there was stuff that the story threw at me that I thought was a little more outlandish than I was used to, and that might usually be a hang up if I was only reading a physical version. The audiobook definitely helped me keep going and kind of like, okay, I just have to accept this as fact now. This is part of the world that Scott Hawkins is building, which I think is kind of the problem I have with fantasy. I just have a hard time keeping up with everything. But this was kind of urban fantasy, but in the suburbs. Is suburban fantasy a thing? I don't really know. So this takes place somewhere in Connecticut, a place called Mount Char, where there are 12 children who were adopted by a powerful man that they refer to as father. And these 12 children were taught basically everything there is to know in the world, and they all are experts at one specific thing. So one child knows everything there is to know about death and dying. One child is an expert on healing and medicine. One child is an expert on animals. One child is an expert in languages and all things linguistics. Now these children have to only stick to their catalogs and their field of study. Father delivers very severe consequences for reaching out of your field of study in any way. But when we are in the story, the children are in their mid-30s and father is missing, so they are trying to get together and pool their knowledge together to try to find out where he is. Do they have to call upon ancient beings? What are things that are in place? They find themselves exiled from the library and trying to figure out how to make it. And we follow a lot of this action through our main character, Carolyn, who is one of the 12 children, and she is the expert at languages and all things linguistics. And it's basically about everything that they do to try to figure out where father is. So this was probably one of the weirdest stories I've ever read, but it was a very enjoyable ride. I really enjoyed this world that he built. I really enjoyed the whole structure of these children and what they had to do. We kind of went back and forth in time. Carolyn, because she speaks languages, she can go out and talk to the Americans because she speaks English. A really funny bit that went out through the book was that the children don't know how to dress in the real world, so they raided an old woman's closet, and the guy who is like the master of all things war and fighting wears a tutu. out in public. And so it was bonkers, but it was a really good time, and I thought a really well told story that completely captured my attention from start to finish, which is a lot to say for a fantasy that has turned me off for forever. So I don't know if I'm ready to say that I'm open to like all kinds of fantasy, but I was really impressed by this. So if you haven't read it yet, I would definitely suggest The Library at Mount Char if it sounds like something you would like. And on my mission to familiarize myself more with the Bram Stoker Award nominees list that was released earlier, I picked up Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a novella, and it's about a 15-year-old boy. His father has drowned, so he, his mother, and his younger brother move out of the reservation where they lived and find a modular home. He starts believing that the ghost of his dead father is haunting their modular home, and that this is starting to have negative consequences on his younger brother. There was so much in this novella. The writing in it was very literary, and I'm willing to say probably too smart for me. Like, there was a lot of stuff that just completely went over my head, but there was a lot on Native American culture. Like, when he sees the ghost of his father, he is a Native dancer, because he talks about how in Native American culture, when you die, people talk about you based on what your potential was versus what you actually did. And people always said he could have been a good dancer. So when he sees his father's ghost, that's how he sees him. And it was just a very interesting story through the eyes of this 15-year-old boy, you know, grappling with all of these things. I thought the ending and everything was well done, and it was very poignant. And yeah, I'm willing to say probably a little too smart for me, and I probably didn't understand and grasp everything that I was supposed to get out of it, but I was still very impressed by it, and I definitely enjoyed it. And I thought the writing in it was beautiful. The next book I listened to was The Devil Crept In by Ania Ahlborn, and this is about a boy named Stevie, whose older cousin and basically only friend in the world, Jude, has gone missing, and they live in a strange town called Deer County, Oregon, where there are cases of children who have gone missing, and a strange occurrence that nobody talks about, but that there's no pets in Deer County. There's not even a veterinarian. This was an interesting concept. I think the issue that I had with it was really just a personal one, and that is I don't love child narrators. I really makes me sad, because I really wish I would have liked this more. There was a lot that she did with it. Stevie is a bit of an unreliable narrator. He has a speech problem, and obviously we are seeing things through his elementary school aged lens and hearing about a legend in the woods, and we play with different perspectives later on in the novel. We get a bit of a different story that I can't get into too much because it gets spoilery, but there is a bit of a folkloric element that I really enjoyed. But I don't know, there was something in the book that just didn't work for me, and I think part of it is being in Stevie's perspective, which seems kind of lame. So if you don't have a problem with child narrators, there's a chance this could possibly work better for you, but I don't like them. It's a personal thing, and it's just a thing that I haven't seen it done well, and I don't think is ever going to work for me. But I really love the folklore that is explored in the book. I thought she did a really good job of that, and then interweaving the two perspectives later on in the story I thought was very well done. And a lot of people had an issue with the ending. I actually didn't mind the ending that much. So that is The Devil Crept In by Ania Ahlborn. And the next book that I read was In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. And I read this for Mel's book club, the Read Around the World book club, because this takes place in the Dominican Republic. It is historical fiction about the Mirabal sisters who were killed after visiting their husbands in jail. At least that's what the back says. And that's what the synopsis says, which kind of makes it sound like they were targeted because of their husbands, but they definitely seemed like they were political activists in their own right. All of this takes place, of course, under the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. And it was very interesting. We get the story from all of the different perspectives of the Mirabal sisters, and 3 of them died. So we are getting a lot of the story is told by the remaining surviving sister as she is talking to a journalist about her sister's story and everything that happened. So we go through all this and we get all these backstories, and we really get to know these sisters. And then I know Christy talked about this on her channel that I'll link down below, but then at the end there's an author's note that's like, yeah, like I was really interested in this and I found their story and I just kind of made a bunch of stuff up about them, but you know, the way they died is pretty accurate. And so I just kind of left feeling like, oh, so I really didn't learn anything about them. I just learned this weird story. And I mean, it definitely sent me down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, but I wish there was a little more fact to it. I wish I had read something that was maybe a little more faithful to their actual story. So I enjoyed it, but not as much as I wanted to. So that is In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez. The next book that I read was The Fisherman by John Langan, and this won the Bram Stoker Award, I want to say for debut novel or for novel. But this is the story about a man who is grieving the loss of his wife, so he takes up fishing, and it's something that really helps him deal with his grief. You know, it's another hobby, it's another thing for him to think about. When a much younger coworker tragically loses, you know, his entire family in a car accident, he invites him to go fishing with them, and both of them, you know, use fishing as a hobby to deal with the grief of their spouses and their family. Except one day, the younger coworker comes up with an idea like, hey, let's go to this creek that I found. The main character doesn't know what to think about that. He's never heard of this creek, and so when they go to the diner that they always go to before fishing trips, the diner owner sits down and tells them the story of this creek that they want to go to. That is how the story is laid out. So for the first third of the story, we are getting kind of the older character's perspective and how he lost his wife and him talking to his coworker and their relationship, everything leading up to them going to this diner. And then once they go to this diner, the next gigantic over 100-page chunk of the story is the legend of the whole history of that creek, basically. So it was very strange and odd, and I definitely cared more about the people in the first chunk of the story than the middle chunk of the story. We meet up with the characters again, and obviously I can't get into too much about what happens. This was a really good story. I thought it was very literary. The writing was very beautiful, very emotional. But I just didn't care that much about the middle section. I didn't care about any of the characters that were introduced there. I just kept waiting for us to go back to the grieving men. And also, the kind of horror that it was is not my kind of horror. So if you're more of a fan of cosmic Lovecraftian horror, this might work better for you. Unfortunately, I'm not. I've tried a lot of different iterations of it. I loved Lovecraft Country, but that seemed to be a different kind of thing. This, I think cosmic horror in general, is not really my thing. But if it is, then, I mean, this book was well written, and if you like that, you might like this. The next book I read was a graphic novel by Robert Kirkman, who is known more obviously for his other graphic novel series, The Walking Dead. And this was Outcast, and this is about a man named Kyle who was demon-possessed as a young boy and had the demon exorcised out of him. But now his whole life is in shambles, and he believes a lot of it is because of the demon possession that he had as a child. So when we meet him, he's living in a crappy, dirty apartment. There are vague references to the wife and child that he had at one point, and while he is out and about, he runs into the priest who helped exorcise the demon out of him, who invites him for a ride-along while he goes exorcise the demons out of another child who has a lot of similarities to Kyle's case. And it turns out Kyle has a bit of power over these demons that he wants to try to put to use and get to the bottom of everything that happened to him and that has put him in the situation that he is now. So I really liked this story because a lot of interesting ideas were introduced. You know, I really loved the artwork. I really liked the dialogue, despite my usual issues with graphic novel dialogue, is that they are very info dumpy. I feel like because we don't have a narrative that is introducing people and saying like, you know, this was his sister, they haven't seen each other in 5 years, the sister has to say like, hey, I'm your sister, we haven't seen each other in 5 years because, you know, ever since that happened, you've been weird. Which doesn't seem like something people would say in real life, so I've just always had an issue with it. It's just always rubbed me the wrong way. I think despite the few instances of that, I thought the dialogue was very good. I liked that so far. Most of the people that were demon possessed were men, you know, which is really different from the usual, you know, foul-mouthed teenage girl writhing around that I think I've just seen everywhere in possession stories. So it was really interesting. The problem is a lot of interesting things were introduced, and because this is the first start of a series, it just drops off. But I just felt like it stopped in the middle of a sentence. Like, it didn't feel like a good ending. It felt like, okay, these things are introduced. That's it. That's the story. I definitely want to continue on with the series. It just felt really abrupt for me. And the next book I read was one that was sent to me by G.P. Putnam Sons, and this is Blood Standard by Laird Barron. Laird Barron is known more as a horror writer. He tends to write in a subgenre of horror noir. I haven't picked up any of his horror books yet, but I can definitely tell there was a lot of noir influence in this story. This is the start of a mystery crime series. So in this book, Isaiah Coleridge is a half Maori mob enforcer who was in Alaska until he made the wrong people angry and found himself exiled to upstate New York to work on a horse farm. Now, when the granddaughter of the couple who run the farm goes missing, he injects himself into the investigation and is trying to figure out what happened to her. This book was very action-packed, very fast-paced, definitely had a noir, like older kind of vibe, a lot of snappy dialogue, a lot of dark, seedy underbelly of the mob type stuff going on. But it was interesting, and I think definitely if you like those kind of stories, you will like this. Unfortunately, it being super action-packed didn't quite work for me. Noir isn't a genre that I'm super into. That being said, Isaiah was a super interesting character, and Laird Barron's horror background definitely came out in a few grotesque scenes that, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I really enjoyed and definitely brought some darkness to the story. So that was Blood Standard by Laird Barron. More reading that I did for the Bram Stoker Award, I picked up Hellworld by Tom LeVeen. This was for superior achievement in a young adult novel. And this follows Abby, whose mom was a paranormal investigator, and she had a kind of ghost hunting show on public television. And so for their next season, they were going to check out this cave in Arizona, and her co-host, and her entire crew were never seen again. And so we're following Abby, who contacts the co-host's son, and together they are getting together and going to go visit this cave and look for their parents. I wanted to enjoy this book a little more than I did because I've had a lot of misses with YA horror, and this was very fast-paced and action-packed, but at the same time kind of had an issue with pacing because we are going back and forth in time. So one timeline is leading up to them going into the cave. The other timeline is them coming out of the cave. So at the beginning, you know that they get out of the cave, and you know that they found something in there. And then there's a weird relationship between her and the co-host where she has romantic feelings for him, but he has a girlfriend, and nothing is done about that. There was also a lot of description of like mundane things that I did not care about. Like, I don't need to know that you put on your shoes and made a sandwich and took a nap and took a shower. I those things don't matter to me in a story. So there was just a lot of things in the writing that just didn't click with me. And overall, I just wanted to enjoy it a lot more than I did. And I felt like the ending was a cop-out. So for those reasons, Hellworld did not work for me. But there is a couple on the YA list that were nominated that I do want to check out, and hopefully they will work a little more for me than this one did. Another book that I did not love was 30 Days of Night, first volume by Steve Niles. I was really interested in the premise of this book. I hadn't seen the movie, and I know it's about the town of Barrow, Alaska, which is, you know, the northernmost part of the country. And because of where they are geographically, there are 30 days where there is no sunlight. So hence the title, 30 Days of Night. And so this group of vampires gets together and decides that they are going to isolate the town during these 30 days of night. And because there will be no sunlight, they can just feed and attack the whole month long. And so it's about this cop and his wife and the group of survivors they're getting together to fight back against these vampires. My issue was the pacing. There was a lot of time where nothing happened, and then at the end there's like 2 pages of action and then it's over. Also, there was a whole storyline that was really confusing and didn't make sense, and it added up to nothing. It was just a dead-end storyline, and I don't know why it was there. And 3, the art. It was very unique and aesthetic and like dark and gruesome, but it was very blurry, and I couldn't understand what was happening because the color palette was also just really dark, and I was straining my eyes to look at these pictures and figure out what was happening. So I then watched the movie 30 Days of Night with Josh Hartnett, which I enjoyed more than the graphic novel. They got rid of that extra storyline that amounted to nothing. They added extra drama between Josh Hartnett and his wife. They're estranged, so that's like something more to overcome in the story. And there was a little more action, everything was a little more prolonged, and the pacing was better.